How Not to Marry a Welshman and Other Success Stories. Chapter 7 Sheen and the Assembly, in which Dinmum runs a fierce diagnostic audit on the weaponization of psychological safety concepts, exposing the double idiocy of a student reporter who uses her own youth as a tool of formidable brilliance, while simultaneously slamming Sheen's partner for the exact same attribute, moving from her Condo of Peace to the classroom, where her extra padding and lumpy packaging serve as a magnificent flopp-able sanctuary for her young Piratey Monkeys. Dinmum traces her own genetic lineage from the Mayflower bookpackers to fiercely protective Scottish and Irish stock. Siding squarely with the grounded Celtic archetype, she celebrates a masterclass in radical empathy that bypasses the public square ego scripts to find pure, unadulterated safety in a long-winded, deeply respectful rant about bats. An inquiry into bouncy, cuddly fishing cats, rubber-tipped arrow sets, and why Dinmum refuses to execute a rigid abs routine just to conquer a tummy shelf, bypassing the transactional mainstream matrix where female chests are processed merely as external property. Dinmum weaponizes her own physical form to ensure that no child is ever deemed too big to be fiercely carried. After running the data on the tedious peer burnout and why sensible women routinely escape the dating swamp for men who can bake a mean chocolate chip banana muffin, her operating system decodes the true anatomy of neurodivergent safety, proving that when an individual truly knows who they are, a malicious ambush can easily be neutralized by the pure joy of a special interest. Dinmum believed that, regardless of neurodivergence, if any person leads with triggering question coming forth, they definitely knew exactly what they were doing. By framing it as a trap, complete with a premeditated warning shot, the interviewer bypassed the opportunity for a real, deep intellectual exchange and opted instead for low integrity theater. Regardless of their underlying reasons, or even the potential, in theory at least, internal merit of thinking such questions and keeping them squarely within the coils of fat tucked behind the bones of the skull, voicing them was totally and unequivocally out of line. Such people were trying to bother another human in a completely uncalled for and unnecessary way, through the reckless expression of their own free will, and this, in essence, was unacceptable. This was the specific type of person who asked questions not to find out the actual answers behind them, but simply to rile those they asked. This baseline behavior led Dinmum to categorize them firmly as unpleasant, a mere step away from rotten nasty, and therefore also a mere step away from Hitler and the way he and his awful goons rampaged during World War II. In a very real way, both unpleasant and rotten nasty humans operated with the exact same completely misapplied belief that they had a right to things they never did. It was an entitlement that either internally pissed off and riled people like Dinmum, or deeply bothered and pained people like Sheen and others, ranging across the spectrum of humanity she deemed nice to completely and utterly averagely normal. To clarify, Dinmum never thought of herself as nice, in the same way she never thought of herself as cute. When her friends or those closest to her, save for her sibling, applied those words to her, she felt an inescapable visceral desire to slam them against a wall and spit out, "I am definitely not nice." It was highly similar to how Aziraphale found himself shoved against a wall by Crowley at the previous satanic nunnery in Good Omens Season 1. She would of course never actually do such a thing, but the internal revulsion was felt deeply within her core. Dinmum was, in spirit, a lovable, entirely comfortable, and roundy fishing cat who went around thinking, to the world at least, that she appeared as an animal mix of grumpy panda, fierce dragon, and prickly porcupine. The truth was, she was none of those animals at all, and yet all of them at once, rolled up not into the fearsome black hairy frenzy she imagined, but a bouncy, cuddly form that pawed around her world. She was noticed as such by children and rare adults, though she remained completely invisible or shielded under a shocking misconception by the vast majority of the public. To be honest, when caught in the middle of a raging sea of ESL education with 6 to 10 pirates of proverbial impishness, she would warn her swarthy charges in foreboding tones that the grumpy panda might be released upon them. Instead of instilling the fear of God or Armageddonish proclivities within them, this declaration usually led to absolute giggles. One or two of them would routinely launch a counter tickle attack while she was trying to mark another pirate mate's workbook. They clearly recognized that even in her fierceness there was a native mix of care and satire that perfectly matched their own bouncy ambiguity. Din Mum always decided the tickles were perfectly fine. After all, it functioned like a free mini massage punctuated by giggles, and her spine was indeed incredibly cranky at times, so she let them have at it. Din Mum had, for most of her adult and solo life, the incredibly odd telemetry of looking a decade or so younger than she actually was, while simultaneously being thought to be a mother far before she actually became anything of that nature in the physical embodiment of Din Mum to her own Piratey Monkeys, whom she had always and would always deem in her mind as the kids. For reasons for both of these suppositions boiled down to the fact that Din Mum was neurodivergent. Therefore, like many others in her situation, her internal baseline looked and acted far younger than her peers, and her body produced and maintained collagen entirely differently than most people. This led to the odd logistical fact that in her late 30s and early 40s she actually looked younger, not older, than she had in her mid 20s. In addition, her home did not house the usual rigid accoutrements of a standard adult matrix. Being her home alone at that point, she filled it solely with the things she needed practically or desired whimsically. Therefore, when any outside humanoid did venture into her domain, they often felt three distinct things. Firstly, they automatically assumed she had children living in the home because she possessed a high volume of plushies of various sizes and even some active toys like a rubber-tipped arrow set she would shoot and secure to her door when bored. Furthermore, her walls were decorated with postcards from her travels, pictures of her students dogpiling or hugging her in absolute joy, and specific BL drama couples she admired purely for their character architecture rather than their surface looks. Secondly, because of the BL dramas and extensive, vibrant rainbow theme, most in the public square would blindly assume their mum was gay. This label consistently confused Mum. When she was growing up, gay was a term she attributed strictly to meaning happy in the old classic books she read, or to men who cared for one another romantically. She was not a man, nor was she currently with a man, and though she was natively optimistic in temperament, she always felt she was joyful, not happy, as joy was a permanent sovereign state of being, while happy was merely situational. Lastly, most visitors would end up curled up comfortably on Din Mum's sofa or tucked into her oversized chair, provided with a nice beverage of just enough, not too much sweetness, and a bicky or two on the plate nearby. They would, more often or not, find themselves taking the very first nap in a home not their own in their entire lives. Waking up, they would slowly realize they had encountered a thing, an aura they could not clearly define, but one that they would, at times later in their lives, consistently return to in their minds. It was a profound peace from unexpected quarters, and a complete lack of expectation attached to it. At Din Mum's terminals, she never really wanted anything from them. She simply desired her space to be a house of healing for those who happened to cross her threshold. Though it was entirely true as a matter of strict security system, she remained exceptionally careful about who exactly made that final cut. Though Dinmum would, at that point in time, be over 3.5 years away from her own formal Dinmumhood, the maternal instinct within her had been cultivated by sheer necessity at a highly vulnerable age. Her own mother had fallen ill when Dinmum was only in junior high, and subsequently Dinmum had taken over the physical management of a household of four, alongside the partial parenting of her significantly younger sibling. However, the data ran even deeper. being born into a family with a mother who was never fully well to begin with, at least to Dinmum's earliest recollections and experiences. She had effectively been forced to become a caregiver and protector from a much younger age than her memory banks could precisely pinpoint. This somewhat primordial honing of maternal infrastructure stressed upon her in her youth, coupled with the systematic roundiness that hit her full force through a combination of cortisol and a lowered metabolism in her late 20s, led to Dinmum looking quite the motherly person in figure. It was as if she had already given birth to at least one or two children, carrying an apparent baby weight and exuding an extreme feminine yet wild she-bear spirit, or in her case, that signature fishing cat, grumpy panda, fierce dragon, prickly porcupine matrix rolled up into a bouncy, cuddly form. This was the exact protective energy she naturally projected whenever she left her condo of peace to make her rare, typically twice weekly appearances on the concrete tarmac of the Bangkok SkyTrain platform. Dinmum had made peace with her figure, almost. She did wish, in some pragmatic ways, for her front, as she labelled the chest area, and her tummy to be significantly less prominent. She had grown utterly exhausted by the white lotusy type men gawking at her front, to the absolute point where she had seriously considered top surgery. This wasn't for any standard reasons regarding body dysphoria, but purely out of a total unadulterated angst at the relentless depravity of certain men, which persisted entirely regardless of whether she wore the aesthetic equivalent of a paper bag or not. She also would have preferred less of a tummy shelf, as she called it, though she understood she did not possess nearly enough desire to buckle down to a rigid, regular abs routine just to achieve a non-shelfy tummy. Yet by her mid-30s, Dinmum had come to a grand realization. Her body was factually not just a gauntlet of unwanted attention for lecherous creeps, completely without any initial designs toward that shore. It had become a magnificent safe haven for wee barns. She was, precisely because of, rather than in spite of, her overall lumpy packaging of an extra 25 kilograms, perfectly floppable for small ones, and flop they did. Her young charges would routinely come and skimmy themselves directly into the safe crux between her arm and her side, sitting in her lap sometimes two at a time, resting comfortably against her front. It was a level of structural comfort they never could have achieved had her chest not possessed that extra padding, and had she herself not cared for them in the exact way that she did. Did Mum observe that most women in the public square process their chests as either sexual objects for outside observers or as the exclusive property of their romantic partners? This baseline psychological scripting explained, in her mind, why many of the other female teachers at the school she had worked at flatly refused to pick up or hold the smaller students. They treated any close proximity to their chests as sacred territory reserved solely for their own egos or their husbands' ownerships, alongside a deep socialized aversion to seeming unfemininely strong, which to them meant they should never appear capable of lifting a child weighing more than 15 to 20 kilograms. Dinmum analyzed this behavior, calmly chalked it up to different programming and rigid social confines that she herself never adhered to, and promptly beelined her way through the classroom straight toward the heaviest charges. She would scoop them up and spin them around in a way that, though only lasting for the duration of a school year, taught them an invaluable truth. For at least one safe person in their lives, they would never be deemed too big to be recognized, lifted, and treated with equal delight. She weaponized her own physical form to ensure that no child was deemed too big to be fiercely loved and carried, which is why, oddly enough, it was always the littlest and biggest of her charges who gravitated toward her the most.
Dinmum would routinely let 3 or 4 of these imps dogpile her entirely, picking them up right in the thick of the chaos. In those moments she moved like a great green intmum in green slacks and a grey polo shirt, her branches laden with a collection of young hobbitses dangling from her arms, scrambling onto her back, giggling hysterically as they wrapped their arms securely around her neck. Ultimately, Dinmum saw her chest through a completely updated and mathematical formula. It was true that it was something to be fiercely covered, and that lecherous creeps were to be avoided with even more cold distance than usual, but it was also, beautifully, a sacred harbour for giggling imps before nap time, and a soft resting spot during it, providing a flawless built-in pillow for small weary heads. Therefore, she cleanly leaned into the latter function and let go of the aesthetic frustration of the former. She could easily ward off most creeps with a single sub-zero glance, and she would, as a core directive, continue to provide an absolute sanctuary for any small imps who crossed her path. If they wanted to flop on her and the extra patty made them feel completely at ease, then so be the aesthetic and the extra 25 kilograms, she reasoned. But back to the completely uncalled for, reckless expression of free will presented by people carrying warning labels such as triggering. In this specific case, the malfunction was exhibited in the assembly interview with Michael Sheen during an interaction with a student reporter who was apparently neurodivergent. To Dinmum, the whole scenario was just inherently wrong, not because of anything to do with Sheen, or even if she took a quiet moment to unpack it, with the core question itself, despite her distinct feeling that it remained entirely out of bounds even if worded differently and with the word triggering entirely removed. To Dinmum's system, using a psychological safety concept to smuggle in an uncalled for attack was a disgusting violation of the human code. However, Dinmum could admit in a certain universe or scenario, such an inquiry, though not being one she would ever personally formulate, could have been asked in a far better way, molded by the experience of a life that hedged with deep empathy rather than cheap bombshells. For example, the person behind the microphone could have asked, "Can you tell us about what led you to choose an age gap relationship with your partner and what led her to choose an age gap relationship with you?" By altering the phrasing, one could, in theory, completely shift the telemetry from an ambush to an actual inquiry about sovereign choice, honoring the autonomy of both parties. It mathematically recognized that a relationship is a co-joined world built by two complex people, not a single person operating in a vacuum. Even though this alternative question still seemed untoward in Dinmum's opinion, it was untoward in a way that contained zero premeditated malice. It actually asked a genuine question, not about the salacious mechanics of an age gap, but about the partnership itself, forecasting a hint of an answer indicating the relationship was profoundly worth the difficulties of the age gap, made entirely in spite of rather than because of it. Such a question would have also respected the empirical fact that relationships, age gap or no, are never determined by a single person. It would have recognized the absolute autonomy of choice by both parties, honing the calculation that a relationship consists precisely of two individuals honing out a co-joined life across their prospective worlds. Instead, it seemed to Dinmum that the student reporter managed to be both impudent and remarkably stupid. While trying in their own youthful way to showcase their personal brilliance, they were, in another way, taking something away from someone else, specifically Sheen's partner, who happened to be younger. Anything weaponized always bothered Dinmum's system, but reverse engineered weaponization bothered her a great deal more because of the sheer double idiocy it presented, tending as it did to blow up spectacularly at both ends, just as it did in that particular interview. The reporter, trying to highlight their own intellect in spite of their youth and thinking malice a good engine for it, was simultaneously weaponizing that youth to deploy an attack, They targeted not only Sheen for dating and building a family with someone decidedly his junior, but they targeted that junior herself. This, in a nutshell, made the entire display all the more abhorrent to Didmum's strict proclivities regarding the audacity of a ludicrous double entendre. The reporter was doing everything in her power to weaponize and elevate her own youth as a tool of formidable brilliance, while simultaneously slamming and diminishing Sheen's partner for the exact same attribute. They calculated the emotional payload of the question, recognized its clear capacity to cause distress, and intentionally overrode baseline human decorum anyway to deploy it for maximum impact. To Dimmum's logical architecture, using neurodivergence as a blanket shield for that level of premeditated calculation is precisely what made the situation so utterly low integrity. However, Dinmum had explicitly decided to watch this interview with Sheen in the assembly, despite how intensely it pained her to hear that question delivered as an aggressive personal ambush, because she wanted to observe how Sheen, after passing shadow that clearly encapsulated a weary been here heard this a lot protocol, switched his jaw not to defensive hardness, but to a total lean into empathy. Sheen's response effectively transformed the interview into an absolute masterclass. It was not merely a display of neurodivergence or disability being portrayed, but an open intellectual invitation to discuss everything from profound life choices to sudden obsession with bats, and this, in essence, made things incredibly interesting. Dinmum came from deep English, Irish, and Scottish stock. Her family could, on the paternal side, trace their lineage directly back to William Brewster, who famously packed books onto the Mayflower because he certainly possessed the foresight to know there would be no quaint bookshops sitting round the corner in Plymouth when he arrived. On her maternal side, an enduring story was that her great-great-grandmother had been Scottish nurse during World War One, or had at least married a Scotsman, and the two of them immigrating to the Americas during the 1920s. After settling into the rugged frontiers, the Scotsman had died early, leaving his widow and three daughters to courageously hone out a farm for themselves in the open plains, a legacy that continued even after a subsequent remarriage and brought an additional three sons to the matrix. In addition, Dinmum's great-great-grandfather had been Irish, arriving in the Americas as an orphan and surviving to carve out a life for himself and his family. That branch of the system did somewhat fall into structural disarray when his son grew up and had the sheer audacity to marry a Methodist. This union prompted the old Irishman's fiercely Catholic wife to venomously declare she wished all Protestant women dead, and that she could walk directly through the remains of their bloody chests. This historical data string was, in fact, one of the primary reasons Dinmum had never once personally considered Catholicism with any seriousness, despite quite liking the peace of Mass. The echoes of that one woman's ill-fated choice of words still deeply bothered her system, in the utter lack of empathy they represented, even 4 generations removed from the initial declaration. In many distinct ways, her genetic wiring mirrored oddly not the geographic place of her birth, but the Celtic heritage of places she had not yet visited and people whom she had never met in person. Their DNA clusters helped hone her individual matrices, anchoring her unshakable belief in the ground up rather than poppy down empathy. This was why, perhaps, her software naturally gravitated toward reading, watching, listening to stories from the Isles. It explained why, when she calculated what actors she preferred watching on screen or in interviews, she naturally settled upon the grounded Celtic. They felt entirely at home on her radar, evoking the exact comfort one feels when listening to rain on a slate stone roof or watching a crackling fire. When asked triggering questions, instead of running a macho, ego-driven public square script, short-circuiting, throwing a tantrum, or getting aggressive, grounded Celtic archetypes like Sheen recognized that the environment was entirely unique. He completely bypassed his own ego and chose radical empathy over defensiveness. He answered with absolute, unpretentious gentleness because he possessed the emotional bandwidth to realize that answering honesty would provide profound comfort to the room and to viewers watching even years later. Even if the question itself crossed the standard civilized line, he flatly refused to punch it down. Instead, he reached out and anchored the space. Furthermore, Mr. Sheen deeply knew, and his partner. Furthermore, Mr. Sheen deeply knew himself and his partner. Dinmum found that when people truly know exactly who they are as individuals, it makes navigating malicious pretensions a remarkably simple task. She thought perhaps it operated this way for Sheen as well. After all, he didn't just unilaterally choose the relationship. There was a whole other sovereign human being with an incandescent soul who actively co-authored the partnership. Dinmum reasoned Sheen's partner chose him for a number of reasons that could have ranged anywhere from tedious peer burnout to wanting to be with someone who could actually bake and did win the Great British Bake Off, to the entire Muffin Man empathy factor that such a layout could entail, or perhaps for some reason entirely different and equally completely worthwhile. Exactly whose business it was on that front fell entirely to the two parties in the partnership, and truly no one else. As for tedious peer burnout, Dimum knew that any young woman in her twenties, or honestly at any age, navigating the modern dating pool essentially waded through an absolute swamp of low-filter, ego-driven, and emotionally illiterate scripts. Most women spend years getting entirely and utterly exhausted by men who throw tantrums, refuse to process their feelings, or treat relationships like a cheap performative game. Burning out on that noise happens very quickly for women who value genuine substance. This was why, when Dinmum scanned her own coordinates, almost all her female acquaintances were either single, completely abstaining from dating, married to significantly younger men who, in the case of one specific friend, chose to pursue her because he had spotted her beautifully arranging a display inside a museum curio, proving herself to be far more interesting than the statues of prehistoric humans or the taxidermied gazelle contained within the glass. Conversely, Dinmum also had friends who had decided to partner with significantly older men whom they had met through deeply shared interests and hobbies like horticulture. And because she had a suspicion the men in question could bake up a mean banana muffin, or half a dozen, as the case may be, Paul was renowned for his chocolate chip banana muffins, for example, which Dinmum calculated had an impact in Lisa, his wife, choosing him and having four imps with, and adopting two more animal ones with, but that is for another volume. The common denominator for all Dinmum's partnered female heterosexual friends was that when they encountered a man who was natively thoughtful, empathetic, entirely unpretentious, and completely comfortable, they recognized that rarity immediately. Age, whether significantly younger or older than them, became the absolute least interesting thing about such a man, precisely because of the absolute sanity of such a match within the absolute shite house of the modern madcap dating relationship insanity. Near the end of the second half of the assembly interview with Sheen, Dinmum laughed in a pleasure mixed with understanding in an oh god type chuckle at the absolute hilarious pivot to the bat rant. Is the perfect beautiful calibration of how actual neurodivergent safety works. To an HFA slash AUDH brain, a special interest is a sanctuary, whether it is Wu Young Wu running a high fidelity data loop on the anatomy of whales, or that student journalist analyzing bats, or deep diving into obscure historic and sociological rabbit holes. These aren't weird quirks. They are pristine, beautiful ways one mind organizes and finds pure joy in the architecture of information. When the young man asked Michael Sheen about bats, he wasn't trying to stir a pot, play a performative media game, or violate a personal boundary. He was opening a direct window into his deep, highly focused special interest. A standard insecure public figure would have given a superficial, patronizing 3-second answer to the back question just to move the interview along into something that attempted to make them look cool. But Michael Sheen didn't do that. He realized the absolute safety of that special interest loop, matching the student reporter's energy of sheer giddiness, and punctuated it with a story that the person asking alongside the rest of the audience could empathize with. Sheen launched into a relatable, long-winded, and deeply respectful bat rant because his software understood that validating that focus and meeting the student exactly where he stood was what he was called upon to do as a human being, far more than anything else in that moment.